Welcome to Playing with Inference. Today we're talking about more technical aspects of AI, such as fine-tuning on-device inference and the implications that this have on games and game design overall.
And I'm very excited to introduce Piero, who is the CEO and co-founder of Studio Atelico, a studio starting to build games with their proprietary on-device AI engine. And Piero comes to the game industry with a very strong AI background. You co-founded Predabase, which is an LLM and fine-tuning hosting startup. You've done ML research at Stanford, Uber, and you were involved in a very interesting paper too that I remember reading, and I thought it was really cool to meet you when I finally had a chance.
Which paper are you talking about,
Aaron? Some of the LoRa-related papers, yes.
Absolutely, yeah. The Lorax one. Have a little bit more about it later.
Yeah. So welcome, Piero.
Yeah, thank you very much for having me. We've been knowing each other for a little bit, and so it's fun to be on the podcast because it's like chatting with friends. Looking forward to it.
We're trying to replicate the grabbing beers outside of Fort Mason while the conference is happening.
That's part of the conference too.
Yeah. So Peter, first question is, or first thing that I would love to hear is, your background is like this super strong AI research, ML research, and now you're in games. Though I did dig up that in your LinkedIn you were covering Nintendo way back when as a journalist. So technically, maybe there's a return to games. Anyway, I would love to hear the Piero version of this trajectory.
Yeah, I would say I've been, like many people who work in the gaming industry, have started being interested in computers and in programming and all of that because of games, right? It's not like anything new, but it is something that I've never done professionally. That thing that you discovered on LinkedIn was during my college years. I was paying for my own college by being first a reviewer, then an editor, then chief editor at this Italian website called Every Eye, which is like the Italian IGN. It's one of those online magazines that have their quotes on the boxes of games, right, when they're published in Italy. And yeah, I was the chief editor of the Nintendo section there. That was the time around the Nintendo DS and Wii and the beginning of 3DS, I would say. And it was a lot of fun because I was paid just a little bit in money, but mostly in games. And so that was contributed a lot to my collection of games, which keeps on growing every day. But I studied and worked mostly in AI and like more or less 15 years of experience in the space. But I decided to jump on in the gaming space the moment that I actually saw the generative agents paper. Maybe for the audience, maybe not everybody knows about it, but it's basically a paper that was published by a team at Stanford where they were showcasing that there were 25 agents governed by LLMs interacting inside a village, and the behavior that they were generating was very credible, I would say. Mm-hmm. And so when I saw that, I said, this is like the marriage of my own personal passion for video games with my professional passion with AI and also personal passion with AI, I would say. And so this is exactly what I would want to do moving forward, and that's the reason why I jumped on it.
Yeah, I remember when that paper came out, and for those that, again, aren't familiar, the generative agents, you can find it through just searching for that term, but also there were a lot of articles that came out about the fact that the agents put together a Valentine's Day party successfully. So that's another search term if you're familiar with the paper. At that point, because that was the spring of 2023, if I remember correctly.
Yeah, I think the paper came out around, probably late spring 2023. Yeah. I discovered about it like mid to end 2023. And I actually start actively working on that really beginning of 2024.
Yeah, I mentioned because Carl and I had actually got started with Jam and Tea at that point. I think we had incorporated, but we had been talking and ideating about what we were going to do for months. And we were starting to dive into some product development, early prototype product development of using AI in games, machine learning in games. And when that paper came out, it was really a validation because there were Not that there were arguments with Carl and I, of course, there never were arguments, but more that just it wasn't really clear. It was very theoretical, and that kind of really helped solidify our idea that no, this is the thing we're going to try. So it was definitely a moment for us at JM&T as well too.
It's so funny how emblematic that paper is, because I feel like everybody has some sort of point of reference and where that came out. Because I remember at that point I was drafting laundry lists of things I wanted to build with this, and at the top was I wanted to build games. I had written I wanted to mod open Morrowind. There's the fork of Morrowind. I was like, I'm gonna make them all smart. And then the paper came out, and I was like, shoot, somebody already beat me to it. I was like, how the hell? And of course, a lot of people were thinking about it, but it's so stuck on people's minds. That was just such an emblematic paper, a good preview of how AI in games, or generative AI in games, seems to bring a lot of people since then together.
Yeah, it was a good paper, but it also opened a bunch of questions, right? Once you really dived into it, and as more information came out, it was clear that the simulation speed wasn't necessarily all that fast. And like when I ran some of the rough numbers, given like the token costs for on the API at OpenAI at the time, I was like, okay, if we ran this game at a high fidelity and added a bunch more agents, it's going to be the most expensive game ever run. Yeah. Which one of the reasons I bring that up is I believe, correct me if I'm wrong, Piero, but that was part of the motivation for some of the work you're looking into, right?
Yeah, absolutely. I also chatted with June, the paper, and he was telling me that their own cost to run that simulation with 25 agents was in the order of hundreds to low thousands dollars a day. And the simulation was not even real time. It was slower than real time. So to simulate a day would take them more than one day. And so my thoughts around that time were, this feels like the future, feels like 5 years from now, games are going to have these kind of features, or at the very least, game developers will have this in their tool set, figure out how to use it. But with these costs and this impracticality, that sounds like a very far-fetched future.
Right.
But at the same time, the kind of things that I was working on, in particular, use of fine-tuning as a technique for getting smaller model to become better and be fundamentally performant than what they should be given their size, was in my mind one of the mechanisms that could actually bridge the gap in terms of how intelligent, in quotes, an agent needs to be able to be useful within a game, and what big model to do that do you need, and as a consequence, how expensive of an hardware do you need to run it, right? And so that was one of the motivations for me to focus on the local models and fine-tuning as a techniques to try to achieve that.
One of the things is, when I started, I also thought, from the way the gaming industry works, having this marginal cost to play seems very detrimental to having the games be good business. So I was thinking this is going to really censor any experimentation, and I still think it does. So the first thing I tried was like, I'm going to take these models and prune them and try to see if I can smack them in the local computer. And I didn't get very far. My immediate impression was that I was sacrificing a lot of quality for those, size gains. And then later with quantization, I still think a lot of the sacrifice keeps existing. What was I imagine there's some secret sauce that you don't want to share, but what is the insight, that the high level insight that makes this on device promising? And how much is it tied to the specific task you have in hand versus how general are these models?
Yeah, these are great questions. And there's a little bit of secret sauce, but the general concepts are also pretty well understood. I would say, on one hand, it's definitely true that you lose something. And in particular, you lose the last thing you mentioned. So you lose generality, right? When you fine tune for specific tasks in particular. So I think let me rephrase a little bit. So you lose generality by fine tuning, but that may or may not matter depending on how you want to use it. Mm-hmm. For instance, to give you an example, the very first thing that I built was me with the rest of the team really, was a tech demo that showcased how you can run something like a generative agents locally on like a consumer GPU in real time within a game engine, right? And the way we approached it was to divide and conquer and define a number of subtasks and then have models do those subtasks as opposed to the general task of any of these things, anything that the agent may want to do. On one hand, that limits you because you're basically then, once you define those tasks, you're basically limited to those ones. And when you have to build another game, maybe you have to figure out new tasks. On the other hand, though, I believe that it is you don't always need the full-fleshed capability of an LLM to do every single thing that you do in a game.
Yep.
And so you can take that hit as long as within the realm of what you actually need the agents or AI in general to be doing, they do that specific thing well. And maybe the other perspective on this is the fact that before I was working mostly on, let's say, enterprise AI, if you want. And there, like a single word off could have millions of dollars of implication if you are about like a bank or any other kind of customer. I think for me, working in games has been very liberating in the sense that embracing the weirdness and the sometimes funkiness of what models put out, and also like design around them. If the model, an example that I usually do is this example is a little bit extreme, but it's good for illustration. If the model is so dumb that cannot even speak proper English, you can make characters that are fun because of that, right? And so that's one example of how I think you can work around it.
Hmm.
Maybe the very last aspect to this is the approach that many people have taken. So I would say more than many, most of the people who I've spoken with that are working in this space, including some of our conversations previously, have been towards, let's figure out what are the things that are fun for the players that we can do using the largest models possible, and then the problem of optimizing it both in terms of costs and performance and latency and whatever is an engineering problem that we solve later, right? And I think it's totally reasonable way to approach it. I'm trying to approach it in a slightly different way, which is what are the things that I can make the models do to begin with? Let me put together a game that exploits these things and that is fun. So it's a little bit more building a game with the building blocks that are made available to me, that are the things that run on device, as opposed to figure out what is the best thing possible that I could do. I think both approaches are valid for different reasons. I'm taking this approach because if I know for a fact that a component is free, meaning that something that can run on device and something that is good at doing something, and then I combine it with another component that is free and that runs well, then it's a little bit more constructivist as an approach. But I think both people, everyone can find success in either approaches.
Yeah, I was going to bring that up because we do take that almost exact opposite approach. In fact, going to Ramon's earlier point of those costs being prohibitive and probably stopping a lot of startups or a lot of experiments before they ever really got started because, hey, how we just can't have a game that costs more than a ticket to Disneyland every time you play it. And our approach, and maybe it was a little too crazy at Jam&T, was like, well, we're a startup, we don't care, we're just going to go. Like, we're going to just, in the beginning, if it does, we have great partnerships with all the companies like Amazon and Google and Microsoft. They give us enough of those credits to be able to do this type of expensive experimentation. And then we can figure out, okay, we can then optimize. So we just went for it regardless, just to see, would it be worth the time to optimize? Which I do think it might be worth talking a little bit more about that, just how different the product development side of that. Because for us, again, we would tend to explore a space, and even the advice I would give to folks is go out, you try something, you try to iterate over use the most capable model possible. Doesn't really matter how expensive it is. And you get a sense of what the full range of possibility is. And then once you do that, then what we would do is we would bring in fine tuning and a bunch of other tools to then say, all right, but we need to get a smaller model to behave like that bigger model so that we can bring it into production. But I think one of the reasons I was afraid to do that is just different, I don't know, attitude, different, is that I didn't know what was possible. And I was a little too afraid to constrain the model, presupposing that what some behaviors might that I might discover along the way.
Yeah, I would say that makes a lot of sense, and I understand like how you got to that kind of conclusion. My experience so far has been that even with smaller models, if you fine tune them, you have enough of, I would say, the fear would be that within the set of things that you can build with smaller models, there's nothing fun, right? And so that is the possibility that we could be encountering, right? On the other hand, our preliminary experiments are telling us that there is something, maybe it's not that same gameplay and the same kind of narrative and the same kind of thing that you could do with a large one, but it is something that is fun enough. And so we want to follow that other approach. I think, again, both are really sensible for maybe they lend and obtain different results also.
I think it says a little also of the different backgrounds. I have a stronger background in game development than
Mm.
AI, definitely compared to you, Piero. So I remember when I was first out pitching and talking to people, and they're like, "Are you going to need to fine tune?" And I was like, "I don't know if I need to fine tune." I actually downplayed it. Oh man, we're not going to have to deal with that. We can probably get away with it. Partly because even though we had a great ML engineer on the team, I did not have a lot of experience. I do not have the kind of level of intuition as an engineer that I'm sure you have, Piero. I've done this. I know it's possible. I have intuition around these type of models in a way that I had to learn along the way.
Makes total sense. Yeah, yeah, yeah.
So one of my concerns, so our take is similar to Geminti. We're also like assume these models will become cheap enough and build towards that. Find what's fun first. The concern I would have, so I feel like that would be the default position. In this also traditionally like in old times how games would be like you would design betting for the hardware to get better in the next 4 years. You can assume that the customer or the clients will end up having the machines that are needed to run your game. Here is a similar assumption, which is the models are going to get cheaper. They're getting cheaper. At some point the music may stop, but for now the trajectory keeps being good. So we are essentially betting on this will be affordable and good enough and whatnot. So it's better to get a sense of what is possible versus what is business wise feasible. Do you think the same tailwinds apply for small models? Does that same like rapid growth and capabilities apply to the smaller models as well?
Yeah, I actually think to a certain extent they apply even more for
Mhm.
small models. We can debate about this, but I'm not super sure if it's the most interesting thing for the audience. But I, I'm not super convinced that the current trend, the trend that we've seen for the last couple of years, will continue to be the same in terms of pricing of the larger models. And for me, that is a bet that I wouldn't make today. Regarding smaller models, on the other hand, what enables them is hardware, and on that side, actually, there are also tailwinds and evidence that pushes in the direction of there will be more purposefully built hardware and probably more because those are the two basically main bottlenecks, right? We have been seeing that on one hand with, I think Apple has been the like main driver in that sense. If you look at the last Mac Studios with 512 gigabytes of integrated RAM, they are better than, in some regards, than an H100 at running these models because they can run actually larger models than H100s because they have more RAM. Maybe the speed of the latency is not exactly the same, but one could argue that for many use cases, having like a larger model that runs a little bit slower is better than having a smaller model that runs faster, right? It depends on the application, obviously. But the point being that I think that is the current top workstation on the market. And
Mhm.
usually the technology that is in the current top workstation in the market percolates down over the few following years. And at the same time, both on Macs, but also on phones, you're seeing like MPUs, and those MPUs are really powerful, and you can run inference on right now, relatively small models because of RAM, right? But you could run inference with soon enough larger models pretty well with pretty good tokens per second as a metric of performance. And so I think there are tailwinds for local models too, right?
Nice. So you said NPUs.
Yeah, the NPU is like I mean, that's how they call it. Apple calls it the
Gotcha.
neural processing
Yeah,
unit.
yeah, yeah.
Oh yeah.
Other people call it like Google has the TPUs for inference in the cloud. Other people call it matrix multiplication, because in the end it's a matrix multiplication thing, really. It's a tensor multiplication that is mapped into a matrix multiplication, so it's actually a glorified matrix multiplier. But everybody calls it in a different way, but actually it's like basically a coprocessor that you can use for running neural networks and in general matrix multiplications, which is all that neural networks do, really, more or less.
Yeah,
So
yeah, there
Here's
is
some very
actually.
speculative. Oh, go for it, Darren.
Oh, I was just going to say there is actually an argument that mobile will, particularly newer mobile phones, like will actually be a pretty good target for this because they have many reasons to have not only it's not standardized hardware. In mobile, you got a lot of different devices, but there are a lot of devices that will ship with dedicated, to your point, dedicated chips to this because they use it for facial recognition. They use it for all sorts of things, with particularly like image processing, camera side. Whereas I have no idea what's going to be inside of a PC. And the consoles, we'll see what's going to happen, whether they start having particularly dedicated hardware. But as best as I know, the Switch 2 does not. Although I'm saying that, making some assumptions. We got a little better GPU in it. So I am wondering, on your point, what's your thought about devices then, right?
mm.
Is that something you worry about? How you want to think about it? Because if you got on device inference, now we got on device inference, so we got to deal with local hardware, right?
It's a very good point, and I would say that obviously, if you run something on device, depending on the device that you have, you are taking some computation away from something else, both computation and also memory, right, away from something else. And that may or may not be an issue depending on the game that you're building. I can imagine that for a AAA game, that could be an issue because every like single instruction that is running on the GPU is hogged by surface rendering or whatever else other wizardry, visual wizardry the developers are putting in. And also memory wise, the memory is similarly hogged by other things,
Yeah.
which could be like the size of the map, the number of the triangles, or whatever it is that is basically clogging the use of this of RAM, really. On the other hand, though, I would say, and you're the person more in the gaming industry, Aaron, so I'm really curious of your take on this. I would argue that is true for AAA, maybe it's true for AA. I think there's a very long tail of games where that may not matter that much. I would say your average Unity game, your average indie game in particular, I'm not sure that they are squeezing all these single cycles from a GPU and using all the memory that is available in a GPU or in a system in general.
No,
And so maybe the beginning of this, the best place to start applying this technology is within those style of games where you have they're not that demanding on other fronts, and so you can be more demanding on the AI front, and maybe just this will percolate up towards a AAA, AA, or AAA game the moment that the hardware will be available. And that could be like a few years from now. Right?
That also sort of mirrors a little bit more the design side in that you probably want to try weird, innovative mechanics on a more indie level where you want the mechanic to shine, and then you keep building towards a more AAA with time. But at the beginning, you want to try it simpler games.
No, I completely agree with that. And I think that also in terms of the kind of developers who will be more open to the possibility of applying this tech are definitely ones that are more on the indie side and the more risk-taking side, I would say.
Mhm.
I'm convinced that a AAA developer today, I'm happy to be proven wrong by reality soon, but I'm convinced that a AAA developer, for them, it would be a little bit too risky and a little bit too unproven, I would say, more than risky. And when you have 300 millions of a budget, do you want to put it on something unproven or do you want to put it on something that it's proven to be
yeah,
giving you some returns? I can see argument for both, honestly, but
We've seen what they want, right? They want another Marvel movie. That's
exactly.
that's what they want.
yeah, we. It's definitely true that for lots of games there actually is some headroom on those GPUs. The most clear way to explain to think of it is you can play pretty good games on pretty old GPUs, right? And so everything since then is arguably headroom on those. And there's both NVIDIA and Intel have been looking into the space, particularly NVIDIA, because they have reasons to be like, hey, we know we know GPUs and we want everybody to have some. And you want to do some inference locally? I got a solution for you too. So NVIDIA has also been looking into the space of how to do on device inference in a game context. And so they've got some experiments going on there. So there is, and it's a bit unfair to say. There are also ways in which every now and then, not always, every now and then in the game industry, we get a little spoiled because the capacity's increased and we're like, okay, just I don't have to be quite as performant as I used to be, depending on the type of device. Even mobile these days, actually, it's a pretty powerful machine. But it might just also be that we have to roll up our sleeves and get back to, okay, I need to be a little more careful about how much graphics, what my budget is for my graphics memory and things like that. Oddly enough, though, one of the reasons I chuckled, Ramon, is we debated the like 2D versus 3D approach, and we were like, no, we're doing 3D. And why did we do 3D? Because we're like super hard. And so if we get 3D, we know we did it right. But if we do 2D, we have no idea if we can also do this in 3D. So we're just going to go to 3D anyway. Now, granted, we were working in Unreal and we had a lot of familiarity with it, but there was a certain kind of, we walked in with a certain amount of skepticism that we're like, we didn't want to fool ourselves. Right. So, for example, with some of the like image generation you could throw in or whatever, we were like, it gave us a sense of you could get away with that maybe in 2D, but could you get away to 3D? Right. Yeah. So we like, how far do we have to push this to really understand what we can do? But as we've established, we might have been a little insane in our approach.
You need to be a little bit insane to go into the gaming industry.
Definitely these days.
I think, guys, I think this is the funnel of insanity. Yeah. To go into gaming industry, a little bit insane to try to do AI in the gaming industry, to start a company. I think it's more and more.
So speaking of such insanity, I know as I was thinking about what we were talking about, Piero, we explained a little bit about what Studio Atelico's go, but I think we inferred it about, hey, it's probably something with on-device and everything. Do you want to explain anything more? Again, depending on how much you want to reveal, like what your mission, what your goal is right now, what are you excited about?
Yeah. Maybe we'll put this in the
you'll cut it and put it.
Yeah, to give you like context, basically the goal is to again create experiences that are fun for players, that are also new for players. And the mechanism to make these new experiences is the mechanism of using AI. We want to get to a point where the technology that we build for building our own games is also something that third parties can use. And I've been discussing with a few people surrounding that. But we believe that the first thing that we need to do is to showcase games that are fun, because it's a flywheel, and that's the way to start the flywheel. And then specifically on the technology, again, it's smaller models that run on device that are specifically adapted to each game in a way that makes it so that process bridges the gap in terms of quality with respect to larger models. And so make it possible to run games with high quality AI on device. That's what we're doing.
So, Piero, how do you make fun games with AI?
Yeah, that's a great question. The reality is that I believe that nobody knows yet, right? We are all trying to figure out. People who started earlier, like a latitude, maybe they have more years of learnings under his belt, I would say. Other people like are getting there now. Other people will get there in the near future. So I don't have one specific answer, but what I'm happy to share, like what we've been discovering so far. Really. So one thing that we are doing, which I'm finding particularly useful, is I created a little tool for ourselves, internal tool, that is basically a mechanism for doing paper prototyping in the age of AI. You cannot really do paper prototyping with AI just because then you basically have to stop your paper prototyping, go on a computer, type something, get the answer back, go back to your paper prototype, and it's kind of like a clunky process, right? And I did this little tool internally for doing the most similar thing to a paper prototyping that you can get with some structured prompting. The reason why I built it is that has enabled us to create very small concepts and test them very quickly and validate them very quickly. And we were able in a month and a half to create 5 or 6 different concepts. We are like can try very fast and very quickly. And also people who are not extremely technical can go there and change things in an easy way. Because if you're not enabling the game designers to use this kind of paper prototyping tool, then it's not paper prototyping, it's like just engineering, right? So that's one thing that we've been doing that has been pretty successful. Obviously, not successful in the sense of that we have already like a working game that is super fun yet, but has been successful at speed of iteration for sure. And then the other things that we're observing are like one belief that now I'm building through this process is the fact that there is an interesting, I would say, overtone window of where one extreme is the total flexibility of using LLMs. In the other extreme, you have game mechanics that are very tried and tested and structured and don't have a lot of space for the space of possibility that an LLM can bring. And what we've been discovering through this process of creating prototypes is that sometimes you steer a little bit too much towards one, and you feel like maybe it's a little bit too much. It's a little bit too much random. It's a little bit too much unstructured, and I cannot really predict what the model is gonna tell me next. And so, as a consequence, that may be not particularly fun for the player because they cannot create a mental model of how the game will unfold, right? And then you start to introduce mechanics, and then you steer towards the other direction, and then you get to the point where an LLM even needed, or could it just be like regular good old mechanics, right?
Yep.
And then you go in the other direction and you bounce back and forth, and probably gradually you converge towards something that is on the verge of being fun because the LLMs add something substantial to it, but at the same time is structured enough to be so that players are capable of reasoning about it and imagining what's going to come next, and also have some grounding, I would say, in a shared like game state or in a shared game mechanics. That's for sure another thing that we are discovering, I would say.
Question for you. So your paper prototyping tool sounds very cool. It also sounds a little bit like vibe coding. Like in my mental, I have a lot of mental, how to say, models for vibe coding and doing this type of like software with just basically you and your friend Claude. But one of them is that it's like a better Figma, right? Like you can, if you squint a little bit, when you grab Claude and you start doing those artifacts, it's a way of prototyping a dynamic version of that app that you were doing. I would imagine that there's some similarity here in your paper prototyping. Is that the case? Is this like a smaller version of a vibe coding
Yeah. So
game?
I would say maybe the way to describe it a little bit better is it's more or less a little framework, right? That provides a bunch of pre-canned functions that are functions that we've seen being useful across many multiple like prototypes, right? And so by building these prototypes, gradually we're saying, oh, this thing is common. Let's put it somewhere. A good example could be like rolling a dice, right? Like something as simple as that, right? Or something more complex than that, or something that is, AI prompt templating mechanism that fills in the blanks with variables that are in the game, for instance. Things like that, right? So it's a set of primitives like that that we've been gradually accumulating. And so with respect to vibe coding, I would say the advantage, this is my take, maybe wrong about this, but the advantage of something like this is it actually makes vibe coding easier.
Yeah.
The reason is it's like giving to, if you want to vibe code with it, it's like you are giving to Claude already the primitives and the building blocks that they can put together in a way that then resembles something, as opposed to start from scratch and having to reinvent the wheel of even what is a roll of a die.
Okay.
And so in my experience, building this prototyping tool is also helping us being faster also at vibe coding, I would say, even if personally I wouldn't consider it fully vibe coding, because the way at least I operate is more like I like to have a shared canvas, and the shared canvas can also be like just a script, right? A script or whatever piece of code it is, and then doing back and forth. Like sometimes I change some things, and then I want those changes to be used by the vibe coding assistant, and then they do some changes, and I look at them and modify something like what Cursor does to a certain extent. But again, like Cursor, but starting from a library of components that is already at a higher level than just randint or something like that. It's like
Yeah.
conceptually at a higher level than that.
Gotcha.
Yeah, we also had to build a lot of our own internal tooling. One thing that we found that was important, advice I tend to give folks in that are doing this is, if possible, work within the engine, because we found that, again, on that, it's actually part of the whole theme of convincing ourselves that we got something working that we really didn't. If you're only working in like a prompt engineering environment with, like, you're just working with the LLM back and forth or your other models and not getting it in the gameplay loop and seeing it in whatever simulation is going to happen, I think you can convince yourself that, oh, that's going to work. And sometimes a lot of the work is that there's a fair bit of work of gluing those things together and making sure it stays consistent and keeps working. So there's a functional aspect and also a fun aspect. The fun, that, going to your point, Piero, about the whole point is like novel games and things that are fun, is you can only really test that, I think, if you're actually putting it in a scenario where you are playing something and not just talking about playing something or creating a little API or seeing if it will respond in a certain way. It's like, we're going to need to get this in a playful environment and actually see, do I or others have fun with it? Mm-hmm. Yeah, we've had to build a bunch of our own tooling that we have in Unreal and even in the game that lets us move pretty quickly. I suspect that over time, more of those tools will start building in, or we'll see them more common. There's so many vibe coding and related tools now that did not exist 2 years ago. So I could see engineers in the future, having a lot more not have to build as much infrastructure of their own. But right now, I think it's really important.
Yeah, no, completely agree with you on this.
Go for it, Darren.
Going back to the point of that balance of structure or randomness, chaos, we absolutely saw the same thing, Piero, like in our development. In fact, our Retail Mage was our attempt at trying to find a bit of a balance. Our earlier prototype that was very cool and did a ton of things and some people had a ton of fun with, arguably went too far on the randomness side. And Retail Mage was intended to show there is a place for this technology in a more structured environment. Now, I don't know if we fully succeeded in that in some ways. There are some ways that you could look at Retail Mage and say, we didn't strike that balance perfectly. I can be very self-critical of my work, right? But it was partly that, trying to find that balance. And I think there will be an art to this that we as an industry will learn over time. The way that the term that I've been using internally a little bit, and it's going to be really easy to poke holes in my use of this terminology, but I've been describing it as structured emergence, because you have this pressure. I often talked about it as like, I want a bottom-up kind of emergence out of like kind of an agent-based system, or just like an emergent, complex, adaptive, emergent simulation. But emergence is interesting. It creates interesting things, doesn't necessarily create fun or engaging things. And so you need something else that structures it and guides it. So that's the point of like when to apply rules and when to let it go. The guideline, and I think both of you have heard this, that we use as a game design principle that we steal from the tabletop industry, particularly out of like the old school renaissance of role-playing games, called rulings, not rules. And the idea being is that at times, video games do rules, and we get these opportunities to be able to do rulings, which are more akin to judgments. And so it has a kind of fuzzy nature to the ruling. If you're in an adventure and someone wants to jump over the cliff, can they jump over? The game master, the storyteller, has a lot of choices in that moment, right? Like in a traditional video game, it'll be either pre-scripted or there's some mechanics, like how is their jump skill, right? And how far can they jump and what is their weight and the physics of it. But in a storytelling, you're like, well, it could be very dramatic and heroic that they do jump over, or it could be comedic that they fall, right? Like, you're telling it for these other purposes. And the idea is that with this system, we get access to choices like that in a video game environment that we did not get before. That is a new tool that game makers, that game storytellers, we've had in other mediums, but not in the video game medium to the same degree. We've had to always fake it a little. And so we think that's part of we can learn a lot from the way that we apply and make those decisions in tabletop role-playing games, when to have structure, when to let it go. The tabletop industry is arguably an exploration of partly like that game design question. gives us some guidance of principles and ideas of when to apply it and what are the consequences of applying it in certain game mechanics.
Yeah, that's a very good point, and I would say this also reminds me of like also long time
Yeah,
role role playing players. My own experiences playing games that like were more in different directions, like Roll Master, like Top Crunch, or like really rule light games. More recently, like the Morkborg and Cyborg
yep.
games, and I think there's a different audience for all of these games. Specifically for AI, though, I think the ones that are more rule light are for sure the ones that could be a better example, a better inspiration, because exactly of the thing that you said, like where you don't have a lot of rules, but the rules are kind of made on the fly for storytelling purposes, as opposed to like to have an actual system that could simulate something. In most cases, you probably don't much need that. Again, there's a time and place for that, and there's players who love that too, right? But it probably for AI, if you have that super defined crunchy system, I probably you don't need AI at all at that point, right?
Baldur's Gate does amazingly well without machine learning.
Yeah. That said in attention. So when I think of small models, I think you want a more narrow, well-defined task. But then when you guys start talking about like rulings versus rules, or fewer rules and more like exploration, don't you want a little bit of a bigger surface area and probably a less narrow task?
I think it's a good point. I would say that it depends on the task definition, right? The task can be more or less wide if you want, or more or less complex. And maybe a good example, like hypothesizing like a role playing game, a rules light role playing game, an engine for a rules light role playing game, I can clearly imagine a model that is fine tuned to make this kind of judgments. That model requires like more data or requires a larger base model so that it's not doesn't overfit as much if you want. While for other tasks where maybe the answer is relatively easy to come up with and you just have to like maybe it's a yes or no question and you the only powerful aspect of using an LLM for that task is the fact that it can deal with free form text, but it doesn't require a lot of intelligence if you want to solve that task. Then maybe for those things you can have way smaller models fine tuned with less amount of data because it's like easier and obvious. Or maybe you don't even have to fine tune anything. You can use like embeddings for that kind of task or something like that. To give you an example, in our breakdown of the generative agents paper, one of the tasks was very banal. Whenever a character entered the field of perception of another character, we had to make a determination if the character wanted to interact with the new character that entered the field of view or not. And it's actually a pretty easy determination because you look at their background and if they already know this other character or if they don't know this character and what are like their mutual interests or things like that. So it's not something, it's something that like a probably like 100 million parameter model will definitely be super much able to do with a little bit of data. You don't need an LLM for doing that. While on the other hand, when the characters started talking to each other, then you wanted to convey like some of the quirks of each character through the way that they're speaking or something like that, then for those tasks you may need like a either larger model or model that has been fine-tuned on way more data. So that maybe could be like a discriminating factor.
I feel like there's a analog here on non-AI stuff. So, for example, in that case, does it want to talk to this person that entered the perception sphere or area of perception? That could just be a random number generator, right? If in a simulation they wanted to make a proper simulation, so I understand why you want as high fidelity as possible. But in a game, you could probably flip a coin and it wouldn't change that. It may not change that much to the player experience. Or like the analogy would be like I could model the physics of fire spreading over grass very meticulously, but for the player, that's not that much different than choosing a random spot at which the next fire will spread to.
Yeah, no, I completely agree with that. There's a spectrum there too. For instance, another thing that in the generative agents paper was done through LLMs was given the lifestyle of the player or the character, sorry, it would decide at what time the character would wake up through an LLM call. That specific call, we replaced it with just a random number around a mean, which was the usual time of wake up of that
Mm.
character, right? And so I think that there's a spectrum there
Yeah,
between what can be easily be transformed to just a random number. What do you need, like a specific rule or ruling? What do you need? Where do you need an LLM, and everything in between? I would say.
Yeah, in video games, we've used all sorts of hacks and smoke and mirrors
Yeah.
and or direct spin. Like in any of those cases, it'd be as easy just to like, if it really mattered that much, how many characters you're really going to have. It picks from a archetype or a table or something that's to select. Or if you want to model the relationship with players, there's plenty of times where simulation games will definitely have some sort of graph to acknowledge, to look at what's the relationship or affinity I have with these other characters that could go to an algorithm. So I think the difference is, though, is that we get a different range of emergent behavior. So we do get emergent behavior. We get emergent
yeah,
behavior in The Sims. We get emergent behavior in Dwarf Fortress, but it's a kind of different range of emergent behavior that we would get with large language models, which goes to a little of the learning as an art, like when to apply this technology and when not to. I know that there's always that choice. Do I get a return on investment? One of the things that I was looking at was like, where in my repertoire of tools as a game maker does this tool sit that does something different that I didn't have, or does something very much better than what I did? But if it's doing something I already did, and it just actually takes more memory, costs more money, is slower, then it may not be the right fit.
Yeah.
But I do think there are ways where we get behavior that, again, like particularly from a narrative perspective, like from a
yeah.
contextual perspective, right? It might be interesting to go talk to that character because I want to talk to them, and that, again, that's that kind of emergent. But the structured side might be, we want to create it. There's a story beat target that we have right now, a pacing where, in fact, we want these two characters who don't like each other to talk to each other because we're going to create conflict right now,
Mm.
right? And so there's these other kind of things that you can be looking at a little bit that might have more of a narrative contextual space, or a bit more of trying to create a fuzzier sense so it's not quite as deterministic.
Yeah, makes a lot of sense. And I would say, I don't know if you're familiar with this. I learned about this concept through a very great video by GMTK of like randomness in input and randomness in output, where basically it's, for instance, a card game is randomness in input because you first draw the cards at random, but then you know what cards they are, and then you can do something deterministically about it. Versus Warhammer, where there's like randomness as output, you decided you want to attack and you don't know if the attack is going to succeed or not, right?
Mm.
I think that in this sense, I think AI could be plugged in all the stack to a certain extent. You can have randomness as input in the sense of you can have kind of like procedural generation, I would say, advanced version of procedural generation, where the AI gives you a bunch of things and then you, as a player, decide what to do deterministically with them. Or you could have something where you decide what to do and the AI regulates the behavior that comes after that, or anything in between, or also both at the same time, potentially. It depends on the specific kind of game and the specific kind of, to connect it with what you were saying, the specific kind of narration that you want to obtain from that, right?
So
I feel like, yeah, I feel like here, I like this framing, but I think here, like the part that captures a lot of the imagination is that you have randomness as output, but it gets feedback into the system. So you get escalating types of. That's when people start using the word emergent outcomes that start becoming interesting. So, like in Aaron Retail Mage, you have technically the player has deterministic. Like they get to say what they do to this item to convert it with a spell or whatever. The AI is the one that decides what actually happens. But then that has an implication on the other items and the other characters in the game, and that is in principle escalates.
yeah, this conversation also, there's a point that I want to make about what you're saying, Piero, in that there's a conversation happening in the industry and the impact of AI in general, of like accessibility. Does this make it easier to make games? Can anyone make games now? And we look at the same thing of, is it easier to create film or create other content? And I think The answer is maybe eventually, but quite often I feel like the state of the art today, I had to get my hands more dirty with machine learning than I expected to get the results I wanted. We're talking, Piero, you're talking about some rather sophisticated machine learning techniques around fine tuning and embedding. I'm not saying that nobody knows how to do them, but also it's not if my only exposure to AI engineering is I've done some prompts on OpenAI or Claude. There's a knowledge gap, not just even of like technically how to do it, but also when and why and what are the implications, what are those choices. And that goes true just from not only from the AI side, but to your same point, Piero, you brought up, hey, these game design concepts, right? Randomness in, randomness out. These two domains, there's a lot to them. And so I wonder, what do you think about that? Does someone need to be an AI expert or a game expert to be successful right now? Is that only true today? Is that going to change later? What was your journey like in this?
Yeah, those are great questions. And let me think for a second what is a good answer to this, because again, it's a complex topic.
Just for clarification, while Piero, you gather your thoughts. Aaron, you mean you needed to be an expert to do these AI games, or games in general that use AI? Or
It's on both sides, right? So, for example, we talk about fine tuning as well too. Like I said, when I started in, I was like, I'm not sure I'm going to do fine tuning, right? Because I didn't know how much budget I had, everything else. Turns out, by the way, and Piero would be a good one to talk about this, I shouldn't have been scared of fine tuning at all. It was super easy. We did a ton of it. It wasn't nearly as expensive as I thought it was. It's a super useful thing to do. And if you don't know how to do it, definitely talk to Piero or like Predabase and all those folks. But like I had to get my hands dirty. Like when I talked to other of my colleagues in the games business, I have to be honest with them. We couldn't get the costs down for retail mage. We couldn't get the performance we need if we didn't do some proper machine learning engineering. But likewise, I don't think we could have made retail mage if we had never made a game before, or it would have been more challenging, right? Like even then we made mistakes. We made game design mistakes that as experts and veterans in the industry, we probably should have later we're like, oh, of course we shouldn't have done that. So I do believe there will be some accessibility over time. There's definitely ways, of course it is, but my lived experience also says the other thing, right? So is it a
Yeah,
moment of time? What is this?
yeah. Let me give it a try at the very least, and then things will change over time, and whatever I say will be outdated tomorrow.
Right.
So let me put it this way. I think probably right now, to make it work well at a cost point that is feasible, probably I'm not super sure if that's the right word, but I would say that is feasible. One needs to have probably that kind of competence. On the other hand, I believe and hope it's not going to be the case in the future, right? I'm convinced that maybe partially because of what we are doing, or maybe someone else is doing, that gap in knowledge filled by maybe by tools, maybe by engines. One way that we used to talk about our technologies, AI engine, as like in analogy with a physics engine for video games, right? That's kind of analogy that we're going for there. And so, while maybe again analogy with physics, if you wanted to do a flight simulator in the early 90s, you would have to put your hands in the dirt of writing your own physics engine that maybe was not general purpose, worked only for simulating planes and whatever else. But at that moment in time, you had to. There was no other way. You had to, I don't know, hire someone with a physics degree. Probably not. I'm just making it up
Sure.
as I go, but to make an example, right? Definitely today, if you want to do that, you don't need that, right? There's a physics engine, and maybe with some basic understanding of physics, you can get away with building the vast majority of games that need physics today. So probably there will be a process that is similar to that in terms of how the technology will evolve and support and making it easier for people who don't have a lot of detailed knowledge of that to actually do that fruitfully, right? And this is for whatever more about using this technology, this AI technology within the games. For the game development process itself, I think that's probably even going to happen faster, because I think the last couple of years, people have built a lot of cool demos, but these cool demos eventually, at least the better ones and the more successful ones, will become products. And these products are going to be used for up the process of development for sure. I myself am not like a, let's put it this way, I have strong beliefs on the use of ethical AI for game development. It's also another discussion topic that we may open at any moment in time. I'm happy to talk about it. But I think it's more, how do we use this technology for helping ourselves, as opposed to what this is going to do to the game development process more in general. Maybe to be a bit more concrete, I think, for instance, that the problem is not that we're gonna replace like artists in the game development process with AI. That's most likely not gonna happen, just because people play games because of the art that is in there. It's one of the main reasons. But I think we need to find ways so that the artists that are going to participate in the making of AI, maybe for instance creating the data for fine tuning, those artists need to be part of the conversation, and need to be involved in also gains from the games and all of that, right? It's not about stealing their work, it's about empowering them. I'm going on a tangent here, I know, but yeah, sorry.
I
That's a
think
good
I think
tangent.
it's an interesting tangent because it's a big chunk of the industry has strong feelings on the matter.
Yeah.
And one of the things I keep thinking is there's the concern of like fairness and copyright as the data going into the models. But then there's also the aspect of how does the art workflow looks like in the age of AI. Because I agree with you that it's not going to replace. I find it very unlikely to replace. It's just going to be like, just like we are probably better programmers because of the help that we get from AI, they'll be better artists because of the help they get from AI. But to mirror the question that they're posed, I wonder if they have to get acquainted, if the tools are going to morph so much in the art world as well, so that they have to also get acquainted. And like one version of this is to say, this company Mythica, where a lot of their efforts is on creating AI slash procedural, how to say, pipelines for art in games. And they're all technical artists with some ML background, right? That feels a little bit like the future of how tech art might look like in the next few years, rather than just being shelved into history.
So I would say we can talk about how we think that the market is going to look like for artists, etc. I would say I honestly don't know, but let's put it this way. I think also because there's like pending legal aspects there, right? But on the other hand, I think we all know what is right. So I think ethics precedes law, right? And so I'm writing a blog post that I'm going to put out at some point in the near future. Hopefully, maybe you can anticipate what I'm putting there, which is what we specifically want to do, right? And it doesn't mean that everybody else will do exactly what we want to do or any other implication for others. But what we want to do is, first of all, we want to, like the intent of why we want to do AI art in our games is because we don't have any other option. The moment when you have LLMs in the mechanics of the game, you have open-endedness. That open-endedness may mean have to generate a literally infinite or potentially infinite amount of assets
Mhm.
that is literally impossible to pay an artist for doing that, right? So if you start from that intent of matching whatever is the infiniteness of the mechanics of the game with the infiniteness of what you're showing to the player, you don't have an alternative, right? An alternative could be like procedural generation, where you have components that you put together into many combinations. If you have a possibility for a user to input a prompt, to input something into a prompt that generates something else, any combination of components will not be sufficient. And so, on one hand, you cannot do it in any other way. And then the second aspect is, so what is the ethical way to do it then? Because you don't have any other way to do it, is on one hand, try to use models that are the base models should try to use models that are ethically sourced, meaning trained on data that has not been stolen, really, which today is very difficult. There are not many, there's few, and they are like clunky still right now. but it is like at least a direction that we want to follow. And second, whenever the mechanism for translating the artist's artistry within the game is the one that we want to follow, is to fine tune on the artist generated data. And the problem with that, though, is that an artist, for instance, may fear that. Maybe if we do a sequel, they would say, you already trained on my data, you don't need to hire me anymore to make art for your next game. And so the point would be to reward them in a way that is somehow proportional to, not really to the amount of assets that you're generating, because that could spiral out, but at the very least to the upside that you are doing from their art, and also to it to be project specific. So I'm paying you to create these images that are going to be trained. They're going to be used for training a model that generates images for this specific game. When I do a new game, when I do a new expansion or whatever, we're going to have to renegotiate and talk again about your compensation for this. This is what we feel is the best ethical way to think about it that we've come so far. Um, I don't know if there's better versions of this. I've been chatting a lot with artists to try to validate if this is even something that works for them. So I want to be in conversations with them to be able to make sure that what we are doing is something that works for everybody.
You make a really good point, Piero. I think as we've had a great conversation the whole time, but one of the things that I think several of us feel and are motivated to be in this moment at this time in this industry is to be part of the future we want to make. Right? I still want to make games. I still want to work with great artists over the next decade and 2 decades and 3 decades or however long I'm going to be making games. And so I agree, Piero, that it's partly on us to build the world we want to live in, to work with the communities, the industry, and find paths forward where people win, where we find the right compromises. Those are not always easy conversations to have. They never are in technical innovations often. But I think it's incumbent upon us to consider what kind of future we're making. And that's definitely a case that we've also had at Jam&T, being very focused on how are we responsibly using AI? How are we using it how are we using it in ways that are not replacing a person, right? Because no person could do the thing, as you had alluded to. And so, yeah, it really resonates. And I think it's a call. I can't wait to see the blog article. And I think it's a call for all of us who are in this space to contribute to that conversation, right? And to talk to the other folks who do have fear. Like, for example, I don't know that Jam&T will ever have AI art. Now, this is going to get recorded. We'll see what happens. But that's partly because my wife is a artist at Disney Animation for 17, almost 18 years. Not no, my marriage so much hinges on this as much as anything else. And that's part of my promise to her, though, is look, I want to get in there because this is coming. We can try to make a difference to show examples of how it could be used in ways that we're proud of.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, I cannot agree more. I would say also for me, something that I can stand like behind very proudly is also one of the ways I'm thinking about building this is exactly like what is that I feel ethically aligned with to begin with. Right.
Piero, I think you touched a little bit on topics, but I think you're unique in many aspects. One of them is that you're coming from AI into games. It's it's like a career migration. But also you bring, I feel like your ethics is much more aligned with what I would find. Like I don't come from games, but the people I encounter have a set of ethics that mirror more what you have, than what I found previously in the tech industry. So I think I think it's interesting to see from someone that is much basically an AI researcher to state this out loud. So it's fresh. And on that topic, how I think we need to close soon. So I wanted to hear how has that transition been, right? You've come from AI, now you're a studio slash startup, but in the game industry. How's it been?
Yeah, so I would say it's been a lot of fun, first of all, which is great. I'm thoroughly enjoying the process of also the creative freedom that this is affording me. So it's been great. There's a lot of stuff to learn for me. I'm trying to educate myself as much as I can, particularly on game design and obviously like on game development, the actual coding aspect of it. But development, I think I'm pretty good to begin with, right? Let's put it this way. I may not be a good game developer, but I have good basics. And so as a consequence, I think it's not extremely hard to pick it up. While on the game design side, it's something that I'm trying to grow my knowledge base on. I would say it's also been very interesting to speak and interact with people from the gaming industry, which usually have a very different perspective and also different like things that they value less or more. And that has been also refreshing for me. I think there are some things that are like most of it's been very positive, and there have been like some examples of things where I say the quirks of the gaming industry have also been surprising to me, I would say. Um, Maybe one example of that has been that the very first thing that when you chat with someone and you tell them that you're starting or working in games, they have to tell you that making games is extremely difficult. They have to tell you. They cannot stop themselves from doing that. I'm sorry, this is like touching like a. It's funny and it's true. I'm realizing that it's true. At the same time, they probably don't have a lot of an idea of how hard it is to do machine learning infrastructure either, right? So, and again, Aaron, you've been discovering that it's not that piece of cake either. Right? You start from the perspective of you don't know what you're getting yourself into, right? Many times that's how the conversation goes. It's funny. I'm finding it funny, to be honest, right? Maybe one consequence of that is that though some people in the gaming industry are very convinced that what the way they do things are the best ones, that it's impossible to do things in any other way. And also that is not super different from some machine learning engineers, I can tell you, like when you go into big companies and you try to propose like a different way of doing things, it's a hard sell, I would say. But and that degree of stubbornness is, I think, on one hand is needed for doing hard things, and two things go hand in hand, right? On the other hand, I find it mostly fun and amusing. But I would say that as a community, not really on the technical side, but on everything else, is extremely welcoming. Like going at GDC is so much fun. There's so much interesting people. You can chat with anyone. You get into a room and it feels like a scientific conference, but then Shigeru Miyamoto shows up and tells you about Mario. It's so inspiring. And so there's so mutual support and mutual help. There's much less competition, at least on the surface level. Obviously, maybe all the people that are doing first-person shooters among themselves, they all feel like a competition. But on average, within the community, there's much more support and help and like positive reinforcement than negative. And that was very refreshing for me, and I'm loving it.
Awesome. Thank you, Piero.
I think that's great to hear. And I think that's also a good note to end since we're way over the hour at this point. Piero, thank you so much for joining us. This has been a pleasure. And I hope to see you soon in San Francisco.
Yeah, it was a pleasure for me also, guys. And we'll catch up in person soon for sure.
Definitely. Thanks.
Thank you very much, guys.
Thanks for listening to the full episode. We really hope you enjoyed the discussion. It would help us out a ton if you subscribed to the show on your platform of choice, as well as shared it with folks you think would find it useful. You can always check out playingwithinference.com to get in contact with us, join our Discord, or just find the links to the episodes. See you next week.